Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Landmark Chambers webinar, Planning for Investment in London. We're delighted to see so many of you joining us this morning, and I very much hope you find it helpful, useful, particularly in the 6 months that we're about to go into. My name is Rupert Warren QC. I'll be chairing this event and speaking shortly. I'm being joined this morning by Russell Harris QC, by Heather Sargent and Robert Walton QC, all of Landmark Chambers. May I begin just with some housekeeping? You're going to be muted, as you can probably see, automatically throughout the proceedings. And there is provision in the Q&A button, with which no doubt many of you are familiar, for sending us questions at any point during the proceedings, including during the question and answer session itself. And when we come to that, we'll try and pick up as many of those as possible in the time that's left to us. And I'll be distributing those according to those who desperately don't wish to answer the questions that I'll be giving them at the appropriate point. We'll record this webinar and a link to the recording will be sent to you after we finish today. As with all Zoom events, if you drop out for whatever reason, technology intervenes, or for any other reason, then you can simply use the same link as you've used to join us this morning to rejoin us at any point. Let me introduce the event very briefly before I turn to our speakers. I don't need to say very much, I'm sure, about how important London remains to the prospects, not just for the economy as a whole, being over 20% of the UK's GDP, but for all of our professional lives as advisors, in some case advocates for schemes coming forward. It's still seen, even in these days, as a safe investment, despite Brexit and so on. And it's still the land of opportunity in many ways. But it's also one of the most complicated regulatory environments to try and bring forward investments. If you compare, for instance, Docklands in the 1980s to the Westbury Printworks case, which we're going to be talking about later on, there's a perfect example of what we're talking about. There are challenges for investors in these times, and there are challenges for us, not just, as it were, to be tour guides to the chaos, but to try and give our clients more of a roadmap through them. And so we need to understand the architecture of London planning as clearly as possible, and we need to be able to do two things: accurately predict the risks that the clients and the schemes will face, and try and position the investment as correctly as possible from the very beginning. And so what we've done is we've assembled for you a team of speakers with particular London experience to try and help you on some of these points today. And let me introduce them to you first of all, rather than do it as we work through the day. I'll say a little bit about myself in a moment, but after I've spoken, we will be joined by Russell Harris QC. Needs no introduction, I suspect, for most of you. He's one of the country's leading planning silks. He has promoted and advised on successive London plans for the mayors, and he's been advising and acting on many of the most high-profile and complicated London developments for many years, many of which, when you look up, you will see: Shard, Heron, 20 Fenchurch Street, Blackfriars Tower, and Elizabeth House, of course, is a scheme that Russell's advising on at the moment, still to come in some ways. His expertise also extends to all types of development in London, and he'll be talking about tall buildings and regeneration. He'll be followed by Heather Sargent, who, to spare her blushes, is one of the country's leading planning juniors. She advised and defended the latest versions of the NPPF. She's been involved in the Heathrow litigation, and she's working at the moment on 3 central London tall building schemes. She successfully opposed the allocation of 5,000 houses and 50,000 square metres of employment in the OPDC local plan, and she's appeared at the London plan, and that's the subject of her talk: where we go now with the London plan. She will be followed by Robert Walton QC, who has a wide range of expertise in planning in London, including the Paddington Cube, Tottenham Hotspur, the Finsbury Tower, and also complicated development schemes, Elephant and Castle, the redevelopment of the Mount Pleasant site. And he's going to be talking about an area particularly under pressure across London, Greenbelt, metropolitan open land, local green spaces, the areas where our clients' eyes tend to flicker when they're looking for opportunities. I'm going to speak first. My name, as I said, is Rupert Warren. I'm a previous head of chambers at Landmark, and I have advised and appeared for the Secretary of State in relation to the previous and current MPPFs. I'm advising on some of the changes to the planning system at the moment, and I have a fair range of experience when it comes to London, Vauxhall Cross, which we're going to be talking about, I suspect, this morning, and at the moment awaiting the outcome of the Citron appeal in Brentford. I'm going to talk about residential development and related points. Let me identify first of all for you some of the key issues which affect, it seems to me, residential development in London. There's volatility, which affects residential land values and prices. And there's also, in many cases, a terrible feedback loop from those issues because of viability through the planning process. Some sites are inherently risky, those for community uses, in existing use, employment uses, those that have transitional or occupy transitional locations in the townscape, and of course, difficult to escape anywhere in London, those that affect to some degree designated and undesignated heritage assets. Design, key as a selling point, sometimes perhaps the subject of too many compromises, which is a quote from one of the appeal decisions that I'll be talking about in due course. But design increasing in importance rather than diminishing at the moment. And then, of course, inevitably, the knot of points about values, affordable housing, and the role of the mayor and the GLA in all of those issues, all the way through the planning process. And finally, of course, central government, notably interventionist in London in recent times. One wonders whether that will continue in quite the same way. But also changes to the planning system through CLG, MHCLG, and where that will lead us. Those are the key issues. And let me turn first of all to the question of volatility. We know that London is the greatest market opportunity for real estate investment in the UK, but obviously we can't ever lose sight as advisors of the conditions that our clients reasonably require for the certainty of their investments. The rule of law, processes which are clear, maybe I should say tolerably clear, assumptions which are reasonable to make, and identifiable rather than suddenly appearing in unexpected risks. Now, the Westbury Printworks case, which has been much in the news as opposed to just the professional press, is an important case because it underlines something that none of us will be surprised about, that planning is a political process. But it goes further than that, obviously, because of what led to the consent quashing of that decision. It will have an effect, I've no doubt, within MHCLG. It'll have an effect on the way that officials and special advisors deal or don't deal with us and our clients for some considerable time. And it's just part of a larger picture of the way that things have been fractured, certainly as far as larger investments have been concerned in London over the past few years. Grenfell was a moment where in the aftermath, and not just in Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster, but things switched in a marked way in relation to residential development with a greater emphasis on affordable housing and so on, and community uses. And many of you will have noticed, though in legal terms, because it was dealt with by consent order, it was rather under the radar, the continuing difficulties over the Ian Simpson hotel scheme at the Kensington Forum site on Gloucester Road, the subject of 2 judicial reviews, both of which have led to delays in the planning process, and both of which relate to the difficulties shall I put it, between the Secretary of State, the Mayor, and the London Borough, and the political dynamics interfering in the planning process in those cases. And one has to ask, given those, what will be the market's response? I certainly remember the response of the investor client in the Kensington Forum case, which was along the lines of an expensive education that I've just had, and it's an issue which goes to the heart of our role as advisors. Another aspect that makes the situation volatile in London is obviously the way that the GLA's affordable housing policy and the way it's operated interacts with particular boroughs, especially, of course, those with different political persuasions, and how one tries to use the 35% fast track route as a strategic or tactical tool. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. But one of the things that certainly comes out of things that I've been doing, appeal decisions, call-in decisions in recent times, is that a well-designed and viable scheme is not only a quick way, but a much surer way, obviously, to a planning permission. There are some sites, obviously, that if one didn't need to go to, or the client wasn't particularly interested in, one wouldn't go near. But of course, one can't develop in London without touching on these sites. And so I briefly mentioned some recent practice and decisions which affect that type of site. Those sites, and there are obviously tens of thousands of them across the Greater London area, where the site is in a defunct community use, but legally its existing use, and for valuation purposes, its existing use is for a community use. There's a broad range of definitions of what a community use is, dropping down from the London plan through some of the borough plans. But of course, because they can't be let, because the original occupier doesn't want them anymore, they are temptingly low-hanging fruit for investors and our clients. But they have, as experience has continued to show, a long and bitter aftertaste if one doesn't get the planning considerations right about them at the very outset. And you will know, I'm sure, about the Parkhurst Road litigation, which led to Mr. Justice Holgate's lengthy decision in the High Court on how to approach matters of EUV and EUV+. You may not, some of you, be aware of a couple of the other cases. So Archway Methodist Church, which was an appeal decision of earlier on this year, as the name implies, was a case of a disused religious building. And the difficulty there was in Islington, there are restrictive community use change policies, which not only affected the EUV or AUV argument on viability, but overlaid it with particularly complicated problems to do with justifying the loss or lesser re-provision of the community space. And that's a case still to be resolved, a site still to be resolved. One that was resolved in the end, but was bedeviled by precisely the same issues, was the Chelsea police station site in Lucan Place, which received a planning permission earlier on this year after considerable delay caused by this problem. Sites that require a change of use to residential or residential-led from employment, often much easier, obviously, when they have been identified for that type of large-scale change in opportunity areas, though they tend to come, obviously, due to the London plan with a 50% starting point in terms of affordable housing. The biggest difficulty in practice is how one deals with the requirement, in many cases, to show that the sites are not needed anymore in employment use because of the marketing policy requirements and how difficult in practice they are to observe. Only one or two expressions of interest, which may in some cases be tactical spoilers, can bring a juddering halt to a scheme which otherwise should secure a planning permission. And so those cases, at the point when the investment is being made or when the client is thinking of taking interest in the site, during the marketing, whether it's soft or hard marketing, can give you a clear steer as to the type of issues that may arise on demonstrating that a particular site, if it's not allocated or in an opportunity area, might arise on the planning application itself. London is a patchwork of different areas, and even if one is in a particular area, an opportunity area like Vauxhall and Blackfriars, for instance, the transition between particularly high density and height to the surrounding hinterland, perhaps in a different policy area but a matter of meters away, can be a critical issue on securing planning permission. And there are a bewildering variety of responses to this in decisions and call-ins by the Secretary of State. So on the one hand, for instance, you may have seen the Vauxhall Cross decision for the Zaha Hadid scheme at the town centre there earlier on this year in April, where 50-odd storey towers, highly visible obviously from the conservation areas to the south, metres away, were viewed as being part of the expected backdrop in an area of change. On another appeal, in a more difficult area, where an employment site was proposed to be changed, the VIP trading estate case, the juxtaposition was held to be too harsh. And it's getting a sense of that kind of issue, obviously, early on, which is hugely important. And then reflecting on what happened in the Archway Methodist Church case again, but this is true across London, housing is a benefit across the housing market area, but how does it weigh in the context of paragraph 196, a critical issue to be looked at right at the beginning. Very briefly on design, because we'll see some images of successful schemes in due course from Russell. One of the lessons of recent months has been, and this is true both at the national level with its designing for beauty agenda, but also as part of what's discernible, I think, as a reaction from inspectors, is a greater focus in terms of our advice, a greater risk related to what I would call the nuts and bolts of a scheme. Amount of amenity space, size of units, numbers of single aspect units, sunlight daylight issues within the scheme, sunlight daylight issues relating to other schemes. And those components, it seems to me, as a lesson to be drawn, should be part of an appraisal at the beginning. So not too many compromises at the beginning, but appraisals 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with all of those requirements met, or most of them. And if you want to see examples of where this has been, this has gone well or badly, I direct you not just to Vauxhall Cross, where a very high quality scheme was the subject of endorsement by the inspector and the Secretary of State, but ones where there were too many compromises. And that quote comes from the Burgess business park decision. So I direct you to that, and also to the Love Lane SE18 case, where similar criticisms of a kind which, when one is advising on a scheme, one might think, well, that can probably be outweighed in the balance, were the Achilles heel of the scheme when it came to it. So in terms of risk management as a takeaway from those decisions, and this may not be possible, obviously, in every case, but if there is a point to be made to clients, it's architects with a track record. Very important, particularly on the bigger schemes, obviously. It's the point I made earlier about viability appraisal with standards at 80 or 90% for the first few iterations to see whether that can work and knock that point out completely. It's about going to the design review panel early on without the scheme having been fixed, without the viability leading story height, etc. And not just playing the game, but allowing the design review panel to have its say and being seen to take their views into account in the second or third iterations of the scheme. And it's about the way that that process feeds into the TVIA. Don't set all the views up to begin with. Allow others to have, obviously, a huge say in where those views are taken from. And even though this is more of a barrister's point, I think it's a crucial issue, because it's one of the things that we spend so much time sometimes having been instructed later than perhaps would be desirable in the process. And that is the clarity that is essential for the narrative of the scheme. You would say lots of officers, well, we don't agree with that point, it's muddy, say the design review panel. What is it exactly that the scheme is trying to achieve, say the members and the Secretary of State? The narrative from the beginning needs to be as clear as possible. So in terms of viability and housing need, we know that London is a single area for housing, and even where there's a huge housing land supply, or at least a 5-year housing land supply, decision makers are giving housing a very significant weight. And you can see that, for instance, in the recent Newcombe House decision, where the authority had a 5-year housing land supply, but both market and affordable housing were given very significant weight by the decision maker. But whether the site is a site where viability needs to proceed on the basis of EUV+, in line now with the PPG, London Plan, SPG, or an AUV, the exceptional alternative use approach, which might, of course, have to be the case in certain sites or certain parts of larger sites, that is an issue which, as I put it here in the slide, for me is a first round eliminator question. It needs to be grappled with not at the stage where the scheme is already sketched up and the client has 750 units in mind, but at the very beginning. And that's going to involve not just the marketing, but a whole raft of planning issues to be considered before they really dive in to the scheme to begin with. Often what happens is that is something which is work in progress, and the 35% fast track route in the SPG and the Emerging London Plan is the way to avoid difficulties with the local authority, to avoid having to produce a viability assessment, and to secure permission as quickly as possible. But one wonders, given many recent situations and schemes, whether it still is quite the expressway that it was intended to be. It still is in many cases, but because it's implicated in a whole range of other issues, for instance, how much community space are you re-providing, it's increasingly difficult to keep the viability work out of the public domain. And of course, as soon as one does that, then questions about maximum reasonable and so on become much more pertinent and risky. What happens, as in many cases, if the FVA is many millions of pounds underwater? Will the decision maker consider that the scheme is simply undeliverable? Perhaps. Recent experience shows that inspectors, certainly in the Secretary of State, becoming more comfortable with that point, but it's something that should never be forgotten. And right from the beginning, obviously, the question of a late stage review, which on the policy, as far as the GLA is concerned, fades out with a 35% offer, comes down to the detail of the drafting in many, many cases. And the Lewisham case, the decision on the supermarket site from earlier in the year, is a good example of taking a robust view earlier on about whether one could avoid the late stage review altogether on the basis still of a single phase scheme. The reality, as we know, is that in the main, one assumes late stage review and then thinks about how best it might be drafted, bearing in mind that the GLA tend to be less flexible than boroughs in that respect. Very briefly on CLG, you've seen that there's a set of changes coming to the use classes order definitions and the GPDO. And what's been flagged up is that there will be a single commercial class that will link through changes to the GDO to residential permitted development. There's a huge issue, obviously, in London about how boroughs will be able to and will, in fact, respond in terms of using Article 4 directions. But potentially, these changes are very important for London development. It may mean that one looks at schemes in terms of multiple phases, multiple aspects to the life cycle of the scheme, where one leads with a particular thing and can move over time using PD to more residential. And of course, that has implications for how you scope it, how you test the viability, and how you design it. And it also means, of course, that we have to bear in mind the need to align our schemes in terms of messaging with what CLG is saying, because in the bigger schemes, that may give you an easier ride. And so to wrap up my part of the presentation, there are two big things I think to think about. One is, from the professional's point of view, how to streamline the process of appraising the site for an inward investor or indeed a homegrown developer, bearing in mind some of these key points that I've been talking about. Streamline because there's a lot of work to be done, but a lot of it has to be done right at the beginning. And that is a process which involves a package of things being developed by the advisory team, which needs to be launched upon the client and the developer very early on. And then more generally, as far as clients are concerned, who is best placed to prosper in the next year? Mixed use developers in town centres, those who have enough financial muscle and land bank to do many sites or several sites in the same borough, so they can switch uses around between them, and sites which are flexible enough to have a plan B or ideally a plan C. So that's a canter through the world of residential uses. I'm going to hand over now to Russell Harris QC to take us on through tall buildings. Russell.
Hi, thanks very much, Rupert. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to be talking about architecture mostly, and architecture is about beauty mostly, and it's about the ability to inspire, excite, and delight. So guess what? I'm proposing to switch my video off to allow you to concentrate on the images that I'm going to show. I'll come back on towards the end. So, tall buildings and regeneration in London. I'm hoping to identify in this talk the key elements for success in developing tall buildings, which aim to regenerate the area in which they sit. Why is this important? Well, it's important because at the very minute, there are nearly 600 pre-application and post-application tall buildings in the planning system in London. It's one of the biggest and fastest growing areas of planning that we're all looking at. So here we go. I'm going to look at history, and I'm going to look at two contexts to give us 6 requirements for modern day success. And those requirements are the need for exemplary architecture, as Rupert has just said. Tall buildings are more visible. It's right that they are scrutinized and tested to a higher standard. And I would endorse what Rupert has said about the importance of track record. These are huge schemes, important buildings, and architects that have been through the loop know and understand what to produce. Second, they should be plan-led if possible. It's not always possible to do that, but if you can claim the location of a tall building is plan-led, it's a great benefit. Third, the buildings need to be inclusive or accessible where possible. They can't be any longer private, locked off domains. Public access to some part of the site is important almost always. Fourth, they need to add to the mixes of uses of an area. They shouldn't create or add to a monoculture. That's a relatively new requirement, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in relation to the City of London. Fifth, they must create their own environment of quality, not just the buildings itself, not just the tower, but everything that surrounds it. It's especially important, in my judgment, this one, for residential developments, particularly those that are away from the City of London, and particularly those that are in already deprived communities. And sixth, and maybe more important now than ever before, they need to be developed by patient people with nerves of steel. Tall buildings, quite rightly, are subject to enhanced, but oftentimes disproportionate scrutiny in some areas. And I have in mind in particular in relation to viability, affordable housing, and especially from the mayor at the minute. We've heard of the Lewisham case just a few minutes ago. I'll come back to that later on. Developers have to be ready and willing in the final analysis to test the system. They have to be able and willing to fight their corner at appeal. So, tall buildings, regeneration, and the City of London. Why do I start with the City of London? Well, I start there with no apology, really. It might seem strange to talk about regeneration in the context of the city, but two reasons why I raise it. First, in the 1980s, the city truly needed regeneration in all senses of that word. It had lost its way Spatially, it was no longer serving an appropriate function. And the second reason I start with the city is because of the high concentration of tall building decisions there. Most of the DC lessons have been learned in the city, and most of the policy tests that apply across London as a whole now are actually derived from our experience of tall buildings developed in the city. So there's the city skyline in the 1980s. You can almost hear Duran Duran playing over the slide, but you can also see that the fear of impact on heritage assets and the St. Paul's Heights policies had produced a bland, mediocre plateau of stumpy buildings on the skyline. The only exception was the unlovely NatWest Tower by Seaford. At this time also, the city was losing ground to Frankfurt, to Paris, to New York, and Canary Wharf was diluting the city's relevance to the financial world. There was a need for regeneration and badges of regeneration. And there it is from the south. That plateau that I was speaking of is very clear with the NatWest Tower sticking out. This, by the way, this curtain wall building is the site of 20 Fenchurch Street, which we'll come back to later. One of the issues being whether it's in or out with the cluster, but that is where it was back in the 80s, and inspiring. What changed? Well, what changed was the recognition by the city, Peter Rees among others, that the city needed tall buildings to continue to function as one of the world cities. And what also changed was the Swiss Re's decision to go to Norman Foster, and he produced the 2004 Sterling Prize winning Gherkin, which was truly revolutionary in any number of ways. First, it was undoubtedly exceptional architecture, exemplary architecture. It's won so many awards in addition to the Sterling that it must now be almost certainly the most lauded new building in the world. It's also developed iconic status as a landmark and a symbol of London, of the Olympics, of the United Kingdom sometimes. And English Heritage deserve significant credit for this. English Heritage understood that this building was in the setting of many, many important listed buildings, including St. Helens here, Grade 1, including World Heritage sites, but they did not object. And they did not object, did English Heritage, on two grounds. First, they understood that the juxtaposition of height was not necessarily harmful in context, juxtaposition of height between new buildings and heritage assets, not necessarily harmful in context. And then critically, the London Advisory Committee advised English Heritage that the quality of architecture was hugely relevant to judging impact on setting, acceptability in the round. And those two truths, juxtaposition of height not necessarily harmful, and quality of architecture central to judging acceptability and impact, opened the gate to further buildings in a similar location in the city, but also for tall buildings elsewhere in London, especially in areas needing regeneration. So why were they able to come to that conclusion? This is a short but important diversion. It deals with the difference between height and scale, and the two are often confused. Scale is different from height. Scale deals with the relationship of a building to its parts and also to the human form and the human experience. That's the scalar relationship. Height is height. It's a dimension, and it's very different from scale. And the best way of summing it up is to remind everybody what the inspector said in the Shard inquiry. The Shard, which is the, and was and is, I think, the tallest building in Western Europe, was described by the inspector and the Secretary of State as human in scale, notwithstanding its height. That's because the experience of those in and around the building would be a human one. The parts of the building were human in scale and related well to its surroundings. Therefore, it was a properly scaled building, notwithstanding its height. And here, for Swiss Re, we can see that Norman Foster has chosen to scale the entrance in a way that makes it recognizable as a city building, makes it human, despite the vast height that sits above it. So that when you see it in the context of St. Helens, you can see that the similarities of scale and comfortableness of the entryway are shown and exhibited here. Look at the building to the right, the building here, much shorter, but it actually doesn't have a comfortable scale in relation to the city churches around. So back to where we were, those two acceptances by English heritage, the juxtapositions of scale were not necessarily harmful, and that quality of architecture was key to judging impact, led the city to identify a part of the city itself where tall buildings were in principle likely, subject to their design, to be acceptable, the northeastern cluster. And this is the northeastern cluster in its very earliest forms after the grant of permission for the Heron Tower. And it was the Heron Tower that came to test publicly those two precepts by English heritage that had been identified, that were identified by me earlier. Swiss Re did not go to an inquiry. So Heron Tower was the first test. And what the inspector and the Secretary of State found in the Heron Tower was that this was exemplary architecture, juxtaposition of height, yes, and wow, look at it, but acceptable in the context of a world city. And again, the scale of the building was human. If you look deliberately, villages of 3 floors, all reflected and respected by the architectural treatment of that facade. And interestingly, one of the ways in which this case was found to be persuasive by the Secretary of State was that it allowed the city to cluster its expertise, and the expert evidence on that being given by Bridget Rosewall, who's now in the news for other reasons. So there is the Heron Tower, which was the first of the buildings in the northeastern cluster granted by consent, granted by an inquiry. And then we turn forward in time, and remember I indicated that being plan-led was a good thing, but it's important that you're not plan constrained. The braced building here, not yet built, number 1 undershaft, is set to be the tallest in the eastern cluster. The plan, the development plan, suggested that it shouldn't be, that ought to be the pinnacle, what's now known as 22 Bishopsgate, and that all buildings should be lower than that. They should fall away from the pinnacle. But clusters don't operate mechanistically. If they did, you'd end up with sterile and bland clusters. They should grow organically and in time, as they have here, as we'll see, as they have in Lewisham, as they have in Bromley, as they have in Croydon. And although the location of this 1 undershaft is plan-led, it's not plan constrained. And the lesson for developers is don't be a slave to the development plan. Challenge it where the context allows. And if the context is right, produce what is right for the context. Now, it's not for this talk, but I wonder how zoning systems will allow this sort of flexibility and this sort of architectural spirit, esprit, to develop. We'll see. And there we get another view of the cluster. It's not predefined, it's not predetermined, it's not sterile, and it's not planned. And just on my hobby horse, again, you can see here the scalar relationship of the parts of the building to each other. Those cross members are city-wide in scale, but you're able to see Eric Parry's design here has got much smaller, easier to see, even at a distance, elements which are more human in form. Very clever piece of architecture. And now I move to inclusive and accessible. Here we've got 20 Fenchurch Street. The issues in relation to 20 Fenchurch Street were, is it in or out of the cluster? And was it good enough architecture? We can all have our views on that. The Secretary of State took the view that it was exceptional architecture. And in addition, that it didn't matter whether it was within or out with the cluster, it ought to be granted planning permission on its own merits. But for this part of the talk, what I'm interested in is not that, but whether in fact it is accessible. And without doubt it is. It's accessible, at least the top of the building is. This is the accessible garden in the sky in the city, which has proved very, very successful, and which the Mayor still speaks of as an important precedent for other tall buildings. And we'll see, even in regeneration areas, he still presses for access to the top of the buildings. But here we've got an office building with publicly accessible view points and vantage points at the top. And now we turn to 22 Bishopsgate, which is the big building in the center of this image. Again, it's Lee Polisano, who was also responsible for the Heron Tower there, but things have changed. This is probably the most recent very big grant of planning permission by the city. And a key element now in the slightly changed position of the city is that these buildings are not to be monocultures. They aren't just to be offices. When I started doing this, if you put anything other than office space in an office building, the eyebrows of the officers at the city would be raised and you'd be told that you were diluting the function. But this is very different. And what we find now in the city is the need for a 24/7 culture to be reflected, the need for the central activity zone to be reflected at least on the ground floor. Here, 4 or 5 ground floors of non-office use, bringing vitality, viability, and more people into the city, democratizing the city. It's no longer just for pinstripes, it's for everybody. And I suppose the pinnacle of that is the insistence now by the city on non-office uses, positive requirements for new uses, which will deal with the more footloose, modern employees that the city now has. They're more tech savvy, they're younger, they could work in New York with its High Line, they could work in Hong Kong, they could work in exciting places. So the city needs to be exciting too. Hence their support for Foster's Tulip, which is a visitor attraction and educational facility. It's bringing the city into the CAZ, Central Activity Zone, but also bringing the people into the city, this form of democratization that I was talking about earlier. And the city are supportive of this. The mayor has directed refusal, inquiry in November. Watch this space. And there we go. So these are the things that we get from the city experience. And I've spent a lot of time in it because it really feeds through to every single tall building consideration that we're now looking at. Exemplary architecture, plan-led if possible, accessible, and a mix of uses. Which takes us to residential tall buildings. And these are by and large away from the city, not always, but mostly away from the City of London. And 2 themes arise from a consideration of these. First, the massive importance of the creation of and delivery of a high quality environment which reflects its context. It's not just about the building, it's not just about the tower, it's about all of that reflecting its context, and having also a very high quality of space around it. And the second thing, which I mentioned earlier, is the need for robust developers who are not frightened to challenge the system and to go to appeal, particularly on affordable housing, where the case being made against them is quite clearly oftentimes a try-on. So this is a scheme for Whitehall, a huge area of NHS property in the East End, very deprived at the minute with social housing that simply doesn't work. It was a scheme by Lee Polisano and David Adjaye. It's a bold scheme, not least because it has two very tall buildings right next to each other in the center of the screen. Very, very different in feel, very, very different in tonality, very, very different in their materiality also. But it wasn't just about the towers. It was about the towers and their milieu in the round. So if you look to the left and the right, there was a creation of a very, very high quality neighborhood. And look at the spine between the tall buildings and the rest of the development. A very detailed scheme produced by, I think he's won 9 Chelsea Gold medals, Tom Stewart-Smith. And the inspector just fell in love with the placemaking. And I think it's important, if you are going to go for tall residential buildings, that you make a place. You don't just make a tower. Also on this case, there was a very, very tight consideration of affordable housing by the mayor. Pushed it until the squeaks peeped and more. And that's symptomatic of the way that I see the mayoral team looking at affordable housing on schemes of this nature. What happened was Lee Polisano took his cues from many of the Art Deco buildings around and produced this remarkable shape and style of building, which again, the inspector fell in love with. And you see Tom Stewart-Smith's work around also. There it is closer, and you see the marriage of the landscape and the architecture. Then we go to Lewisham. We spoke about this case earlier with Rupert. It was a remarkable case where the mayor directed refusal, notwithstanding 3 resolutions to grant by Lewisham. Now, there weren't many cues of quality for the architects to look at here, EPR, but they designed a tall, elegant building, a tripartite structure. The way the building meets the sky is light and elegant, but they also drew some history in. Along with all of the other gateway buildings in Lewisham, they all have a touch of gold, which reflects the gold braid that was manufactured on this river. And every one of the Lewisham gateway, you can just make it out on some of the others, gateway buildings, has that thread of history, literal thread of history running through them. This scheme was important for 3 reasons. First reason was the quality of the space around the building, which the inspector said was critical to its success. This was an old Tesco car park. Second, it's evidence of the special, and I would say disproportionate, scrutiny that the mayor directed at it in terms of affordable housing. In the end, 6 underline, 6 independent housing consultants said that the scheme was providing more than the reasonable maximum provision. We got to inquiry, and after 2 cross-examinations, Lewisham threw their hand in. The mayor was directed by the inspector that he thought they should throw their hand in, that they were at risk of costs if they didn't, but they pressed on, and as many of you will know, costs were awarded against the mayor. And here we had a team of developers who held their nerve, because they were certain that the evidence that was being pushed against them in relation to affordable housing didn't stack up. It's not always the case, and very many developers feel it necessary to give as much as they can on affordable housing, even though it might be more than the policy requires. It's a difficult judgment. Here we are now. This is out in Docklands. This is the Isle of Dogs. This is Madison, closest to us, and 20 Marsh Wall. both by make. The importance of this case lies in the weight given by the inspector to the park and open space that was created between the two. It's second in scale only to Canada Square in terms of open space in the Isle of Dogs. And again, emphasizes, particularly when it comes to residential, that it's very much more than about the towers. Oftentimes, as Rupert was saying, it's very difficult in these buildings to get amenity space internal, and therefore it has to be provided externally, but in a way that also serves the community. And at this location on Marsh Wall, the inspector, read the decision letter, was full of praise for the contribution it would make to the public realm in the round. This case is also relevant for the affordable housing. Again, the scheme was pressed to and beyond the PIPs, and an appeal was needed to test the system, to prove the system, and to get the right amount of affordable housing. And there you see it in context. Look at the juxtaposition between the lower houses and the Madison and 20, Dollar Bay, everything moving up towards 1 Canada Square. And the scale of the space for public use. And then Newcomb House, which was also mentioned by Rupert, in a surprisingly run-down and depressed area of Kensington. What was critical here was the creation of the new square for Kensington, which we can see here. Social housing above, quite Swiss shops, but a new place of great quality and a tall building. You don't really see it here. It's split into two. The 2D image doesn't do it credit. A 2D image designed by Vesna Bostandic, who is my tip for the top. She's an inspirational artist, and she will be producing great architecture for many years to come. So what does all that mean? In the middle of the Heron inquiry, which was full of pianoisms, Renzo Piano said to the inspector, I'm going to look you straight in the eye and say that the Shard is going to be a badge of good change. And it's not very grammatically correct, but it was the perfect thing to say. Because if it works, and if the quality is there, tall buildings can transition an area and be a beacon of change and regeneration. London Bridge and areas to the south were, as I remember in my Crown Court days, areas that you didn't often go to unless you had to, particularly wearing a suit and carrying a wig. But now with More London, Foster, with the Shard, Piano, and all of the other new buildings around, it's become a real part of London, more London in more senses than one. And I think the tall buildings have played their part in guiding that and being a beacon of regeneration. And there we are in the happier days. And here we got Vauxhall. Now, Vauxhall didn't start so well. This was a tower that the inspectorate didn't like. This was affordable and market housing that, in my judgment, is too dense, and it set off on the wrong foot. But 4 or 5 developments later, even Vauxhall is becoming a regenerated area, and tall buildings have played their part. It goes to show that you should start on the right foot if you can, but even where there are difficulties, and I think this was a difficult position, tall buildings such as those that Rupert's just got consent for, and others very close to the transport linkages have turned Vauxhall and Nine Elms around. It's not just there yet, the jury's still out, I think, but it has the potential. So that's all from me. Those are my 6 points, if you like, the 6 things that hopefully will get you your permission. But in order to do so, you've got to navigate the London plan, which is not in a happy place at the minute. And to tell us about that, here's Heather Sargent. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Russell, and hi, everyone. Let's start with a quick recap of where we are with the London plan. So the panel issued its report on the 8th of October last year and concluded that provided that it was amended to reflect the panel's recommendations, the plan would meet the tests of soundness. The intend to publish version of the plan was then issued by the Mayor on the 9th of December, and of the 55 recommendations that had been made by the panel, the intend to publish version took forward 30 of those in full, accepted 10 in part or with amendment, and rejected 15 of them outright. But then on the 13th of March this year, the Secretary of State sent, how shall I put it, a very robustly worded letter to the Mayor. He directed that the plan couldn't be published until the directions set out by the Secretary of State were incorporated. We'll look at the detail of what the Secretary of State said in a moment. But one thing that he did say was that he was content to consider alternative changes to policy to address his concerns. And the Mayor then responded to the directions on the 24th of April. That's the latest kind of shot that's publicly available. So, looking at the Mayor's response, his position is that certainty for the industry is crucial to supporting the development industry and the wider economy in recovering from the COVID-19 crisis. And so he says we must work together constructively to publish the London plan as quickly as possible. Conversations are apparently underway between officials about the directions. The Mayor says these are in line with the Secretary of State's commitment to consider alternative policy changes. And you'll see from the first quote here that the Mayor's plainly not keen on simply incorporating the Secretary of State's directions wholesale. The final quote from the letter that I've set out on this slide, personally, I wonder whether that's a veiled reference to the possibility of the plan being abandoned altogether, which I'm sure relatively few people would welcome as an outcome. Now, the mayoral elections have, of course, been postponed until next year. So in theory, the Mayor has more time to negotiate with the Secretary of State now before purdah kicks in. But the public position on his website is that he is still working towards summer 2020 for publication of the final plan. Before we focus on the areas of controversy between the Mayor and the Secretary of State, it's important to note that the Mayor's position is that policies contained in the intend to publish version of the plan that are not subject to the directions from the Secretary of State carry now significant weight in determining planning applications, and having regard to paragraph 48 of the NPPF, in my view, that's an appropriate stance. So I said we'd come back to consider the Secretary of State's letter that accompanied his directions. It's really the letter and the directions that give the most recent clues as to likely directions of travel for the plan. So to summarise the criticisms made of the Mayor, amongst the factors that are noted by the Secretary of State as contributing to the deeply disappointing, he says, housing delivery, are the stalling of critical strategic sites. The Secretary of State refers expressly to the Old Oak and Park Royal development as an example. He also flags the conditions that have been imposed on estate regeneration schemes. And then he points to the large gap that's appeared between the plan's housing target and London's housing need. We'll come back to that, but the Secretary of State's view is that the anticipated framework for a step change in housing delivery simply hasn't materialised. He also objects to the focus on one-bed flats in the plan, and that is something that he tackles in his directions. I know many people at the examination of the plan were in agreement on this next one about the plan being overly prescriptive. The Secretary of State thinks that this makes the planning process more cumbersome and difficult to navigate, so that fewer developments come forward and those that do progress slowly. And then finally, we get to the criticism that is actually what legally entitles the Secretary of State to make the directions, so the plan being contradictory to national policy. The letter then goes on to identify various specific areas in which the Secretary of State considers that the plan has fallen short. Before we move on to consider some of those, it's worth noting the final section of the Secretary of State's letter, which is headed Future Housing Delivery in London. Now here the Secretary of State asks the Mayor to commit to maximising delivery in London, including through taking proactive steps to surpass the housing requirement in the plan. And that commitment is to include, amongst other things, a programme of work with MHCLG to kickstart stalled strategic sites. So the letter actually goes quite far beyond what the Secretary of State can achieve by way of directed modification to the draft plan. the Secretary of State really took the opportunity to make his wider ambitions in respect of housing delivery in London clear to the Mayor. Turning then to look at some of the key areas of contention as between, first of all, the Mayor and the panel, and now the Secretary of State as well. Small sites are sites of less than 0.25 hectares, and the panel noted that the Mayor's approach was policy-led rather than being based on any case studies or pilots, and the panel had major misgivings about what it termed the arbitrary growth assumption that underlay the small sites policy, and also the large scale of change that was envisaged. So the panel's conclusion was that the small sites targets weren't realistically achievable, and the presumption in favour of small housing developments, which was policy H2A, has been deleted. The small sites target has been revised down, and obviously the overall housing target has come down too as a result, but that means that there is now a very large gap between the housing target of 52,000 dwellings per annum and the identified housing need of 66,000 dwellings per annum. Looking at the panel's response to that development, so to the appearance of this gap as a result of the small sites policy, the panel decided against pausing the plan or determining that it should be withdrawn because of the delay that would result. Interestingly, it identified as the solution to increasing the number of deliverable units either a green belt review or exploring possibility within the wider southeast. But of course, either one of those options would take time as well, so the panel in essence decided to press on. Now, as we've seen already, the Secretary of State in his letter did flag the gap between the housing target and housing needs. So what I want to do now is to consider how, if at all, his directions might assist in narrowing that gap. The first point here is on industrial land. The Mayor wanted to include a requirement of no net loss of capacity within designated strategic industrial land and locally significant industrial sites, but the Secretary of State has directed that that no net loss requirement be removed. And as I explain in the slide, the supporting text now requires boroughs to seek to deliver intensified floor space capacity in either existing and or new appropriate locations. The Secretary of State's view is that this will make it easier for the boroughs, amongst other things, to replace existing industrial land, and then that existing industrial land can subsequently be released for housing development. Now, on the face of it, that additional flexibility seems attractive from the perspective of other objectives, such as taking advantage of existing infrastructure. But I do query where exactly these existing industrial sites are supposed to be decanted to so that they can be redeveloped for housing. I mean, are there acres of land sat there waiting to welcome industrial development, or are those acres subject to constraints such as green belt? Turning to green belt and the draft plan, the directions bring the plan's green belt policy in line with the NPPF by introducing the very special circumstances and the exceptional circumstances tests. Personally, I'd be extremely surprised if the Mayor were able to negotiate out of that suggested change. But the more interesting aspect of the plan in relation to the green belt, I think, is a recommendation that was made by the panel but which neither the Mayor nor the Secretary of State have taken up. As you can see, the panel reached the inescapable conclusion that if London's development needs are to be met in future, then a review of the green belt should be undertaken at least to establish any potential for sustainable development. But the Mayor didn't accept the panel's recommendation that the plan include a commitment to a green belt review in the next London plan. As far as the Secretary of State's response to that goes, his letter and his directions are silent in respect of Greenbelt review. To be honest, this Greenbelt review question feels to me a little bit like a game of pass the parcel, where the forfeits are so bad that no one wants to be left holding the parcel when the music stops. The Secretary of State's letter does refer to preventing unnecessary urban sprawl so that we can protect the countryside for future generations, to densifying, to taking advantages of opportunities around existing infrastructure, and to making the best use of brownfield and underutilised land. Now, all of that mostly points away from Greenbelt release, but then again, the infrastructure point might well be a point in favour of Greenbelt release in certain circumstances. The letter also refers to the Mayor's failure to take the tough choices necessary to bring enough land into the system to build the homes needed. I was half expecting that to lead to a much less Delphic criticism of the Mayor's failure to commit to a Greenbelt review, but no, that's not what we find in the letter. So in the absence of a commitment to a Greenbelt review by the Mayor, it will be up to the boroughs to apply the exceptional circumstances test when they're bringing forward their plans. And on that note, you'll recall that the Secretary of State in his letter complains that the Mayor's draft of the plan actively discourages ambitious boroughs. And in the letter, he directs the Mayor to work constructively with ambitious boroughs and to support them in going beyond the housing targets in the plan. So I think it will be interesting to see whether that does, in due course, translate into support for boroughs who are seeking to manifest their ambition by releasing land from the Greenbelt. Very briefly then on density, the Secretary of State has directed changes to policy D3, which deals with this, but the requirement remains that the design of the development must optimise site capacity. The Secretary of State has, though, sought to give more guidance on the most suitable locations for higher density development. So as you can see, these are to be promoted in areas that are well connected to jobs, services, infrastructure and amenities, by public transport, walking and cycling. There's also a requirement that boroughs positively consider the expansion of existing clusters of high density development, and the Secretary of State states that this could include expanding opportunity areas where appropriate. And then for low and mid density locations, what is envisaged is gentle densification. So to draw some conclusions as to where we are with the plan and where we might be going, I think the key point really is that there is now a significant gap between housing need and the plan's housing target. The panel thought that the solution to that was either Greenbelt review or further exploration of potential with local authorities within the wider South East. It seems as though the Secretary of State's preference might be for the latter solution, insofar as he hasn't sought to impose a commitment to Greenbelt review in the plan. He has, though, said that he wants the Mayor to commit to producing and delivering a new strategy with authorities in the wider South East to offset unmet housing need. But that said, the Secretary of State's letter did ask the Mayor to start considering the next London plan immediately, and presumably the next plan will somehow have to accommodate the gap that's arisen. Meanwhile, and slightly ironically, it seems to me, the Secretary of State issued his planning for the future document on the same day as the directions in respect of the plan, and said that he wanted all local planning authorities to have up-to-date local plans by December 2023. I have to say that for London authorities, the protracted process in relation to this iteration of the London plan and the prospect of the next one coming around the corner doesn't particularly assist, it seems to me, in boroughs meeting that ambition. So that's everything for me on the London plan. I'll hand over to Rob, who's going to deal with metropolitan open land, green belt and local green spaces.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking, as Heather says, about MOL, Greenbelt and local green spaces. Just to say thanks to Kim Zia, one of our superstar juniors, who has helped me put the slides together. And just a couple of preliminary points, just building on what the others have said. The pictures from Russell's slides in particular reminded me of the quality of the images that now are part and parcel of promoting any scheme. And the one of the ones of the Gherkin remind me, I had some involvement in that way back at the start of my career. And comparatively, the number of images we had of the Gherkin, a tiny, tiny number, and effectively drawn in crayon compared to what we have nowadays. So that the importance of imagery brought to a start realization there. And then secondly, just in terms of Rupert's point about the importance of the narrative, for those of you who haven't seen it, have a look also at the North London Business Park case, which was consented last year, just in terms of the way that was presented and the balance there between the residential development and the outdoor public space, picking up on the point that Russell was making too. So a quick canter through my talk. I'll be dealing with definitions first, policies, a quick catch up on the appeal decisions, or rather some of the appeal decisions over the last year, and some success stories and some cautionary tales. So in terms of what they are, it's a sort of Russian dolls thing, really. We've got, starting at the bottom, the local green space. These are areas of particular importance to local communities. And then, of course, for London, we've got metropolitan open land defined in the Emerging London Plan as extensive areas of land bounded by urban development that fulfills a similar function to Greenbelt. And then, of course, the Greenbelt itself. All, as we see, subject to exactly the same policy in terms of Greenbelt protection. Those are where you find the policies, just a table there giving the references in terms of the current plan, the new plan, and then, of course, government policy in the NPPF and the PPG. What do they say? Well, there's a lot of, wherever you look, especially at development plan policy, a lot of sort of rehashing, frankly, of what's said in the NPPF. And wouldn't it be simpler if all local plans just said we'll protect the green belt in the same way that it is protected in the NPPF? It would save a lot of time. But London plan, strongest protection given to London's green belt, and of course the inappropriate development test. And just to confirm the point I've made in relation to the MOL, same protection as Greenbelt. And then in terms of local green space, that via the London plan, but also as set out in the NPPF, gets the same policy protection as Greenbelt policy, as the Greenbelt does. Then in terms of what the NPPF says, and therefore what frankly all development plans say or should say, as you'll be fully familiar, the essential characteristics are openness and permanence. The 5 purposes are set out in 134, the inappropriate development test. I was just going to drop in though on 144, because when you get to the weighing, the balancing exercise, the policy test is that for a clear outweighing in terms of the harm caused must be clearly outweighed by the benefits delivered. And the word clearly there must mean something. And it just brings to mind a case I did in Solihull early in the year, where we persuaded the inspector that, I think on a fair reading of the decision, that the benefits did outweigh the harm, but it was finely balanced and those benefits didn't clearly outweigh. And so the scheme was refused. And so there you have a scheme where the good things outweigh the bad things, but not clearly enough. And so the scheme was turned down. The query, the sense that actually makes. And then 145 and 146, you've got the closed list of exceptions in terms of new buildings, and then other matters in 146, and a brief footnote on 147 in relation to energy projects. And going back, of course, to the point that Rupert made at the start about clients' eyes flickering over difficult areas, if you are looking at Greenbelt, if you are looking at local green space, for example, there is, of course, the difficulty of those designations appearing in the footnote to paragraph 11, and what that means in terms of the disapplication of the tilted balance. Then in terms of the PPG, I just set out the factors there in terms of what factors can be taken into account, and it refers, of course, to spatial and visual aspects. But just to flag up for you, of course, the run of case law, Sam Smith most recently, in terms of whether visual aspects necessarily feed into the question of impact on openness. That they can, but they don't necessarily have to. And then in terms of the trawl through the recent appeal decisions, we found 12 in relation to London over the past year, only 4 of which were successful. So again, going back to Rupert's point about the difficulty of promoting these sorts of sites. Harrow, the school promoted a revamp of its educational facilities and sports facilities, and it was common ground that the scheme was inappropriate development in the MOL. No visual harm, which again, if you read that decision, that's an interesting conclusion. Obviously, a matter of judgment, but it's quite a lump of development there. But no visual harm. And then there was harm through the erosion of the MOL. Then there was an interesting way of response from the school. There was a 106 which proposed treating an area of land as an MOL extension, but you'll see from the decision in that case, yes, it was seen as a pragmatic and reasonable approach, but not much weight given to it. But again, a creative approach in terms of protecting additional areas of land. But the thing that comes out of this case, and from a review of all the cases is the package of things you need to put together if you are going to put forward a very special circumstances case. Educational need, obviously, in new schools and the like, get great weight in accordance with the NPPF. But it's similar to the points Russell was making about, how do you get the tall buildings off the ground? It's making sure those public benefits are there and freely available. So here we've got access to local state schools, community groups, and that again was a critical factor. Always though, and regardless of the type of scheme you're promoting, a lack of alternative sites, and you can see that across the board in terms of housing provision in particular. If you can show that there aren't alternative sites to meet the need, then you are in a good place in terms of very special circumstances. And frankly, without those, especially in the context of housing, need and alternatives, you are, I think, very much on the back foot in terms of greenbelt provision. That went to the High Court, and it didn't get off the ground, with the warning of the overly legalistic challenges echoing in the claimant's ears. Then we've got a filling station out near Heathrow, and you can see from the bottom of that slide a conclusion of not inappropriate development. So again, that depended on a very careful analysis of the impact the scheme would have, and in that case, the developer won the argument that the scheme wouldn't be inappropriate development, and at that point, of course, the greenbelt prohibitions effectively fall away. Another example where not inappropriate development, this was the reuse of an existing building for residential development, and again, looking at the possible exceptions you can see in the middle of that slide in terms of how the claimant team was seeking to position that development, and persuaded the inspector that it wasn't inappropriate development, and therefore, effectively a green light in greenbelt terms. Floodlights in the will to win Chiswick House case, as I say in the slides, they're very brief consideration given to the MOL issues. But again, it was a question of openness and a matter of judgment. And in that case, no material harm to openness found. This was a case Rupert and I were involved in. This was the redevelopment of a local green space. It was actually during the course of the inquiry that, due to a rather protracted local plan process, the site became, it was confirmed that it was local green space during the inquiry. It was obviously escalated it to effectively greenbelt status. And again, just going back to the point I was making in terms of the package of things that were being put together, this was a really serious offer in terms of enhanced sports provision. The site was effectively closed off to public access. There was a little bit of sports usage, but the sports facilities proposed were thoroughly comprehensive. There was also a decent slab of residential development designed to meet a particular need for the elderly. And so that decision repays careful reading because of the way in which, despite that, as I say, very comprehensive package, the scheme was turned down by the inspector. And then just a few points, not so much cautionary tales, I suppose, as just a couple of points to pick out in terms of some finer detail. We've got inspectors looking at the scheme as a whole, as of course they must do following the High Court's decision. You can, Miss Justice Holgate in particular has told us how to do that and what the NPPF doesn't and doesn't require. Then a couple of examples of, again, just site specific, but the extent to which extant permissions on the site were seen as being relevant. The barge dock site had a slightly strange approach from the inspector in that the comparison was obviously made, or the appropriateness of the scheme was considered in its own right. And then, to my reading, a slightly muddled approach in terms of the relevance of a fallback. But the stables case, the existence of an extant permission was seen as relevant. This is a nuanced point. There is that exception at the tail end of paragraph 145 in the NPPF about the extent to which you are allowed to harm the openness of the greenbelt if your scheme is making a contribution towards affordable housing. And the inspector in that case said that exception, you couldn't bring yourself within that exception if if your scheme was making an off-site contribution towards affordable housing, and so that I think is a questionable approach in terms of what is being proposed. Then just to sign off London Plan Policy 717 in terms of consistency with the NPPF and full weight being given to it in the steam packet steps case, and then a finding that a radio mast was a building operation, not an engineering operation in the Lordlands Farm case. So just to wrap that up, the messages that come out, or in terms of the big messages that come out of the Greenbelt MOL LGS cases this year, and an eternal message, frankly, until the policy is scrapped, is the need to make sure that if you are going to be, if you are proposing inappropriate development, the package of very special circumstances has to be, really very, very comprehensive. And if you haven't got a need and you haven't got an alternative sites case, particularly in the context of housing, then you're starting very much on the back foot. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you to Russell and Heather too. We have a few minutes just to pick up a number of questions. There's been a late rush of questions on the vexed issue of metropolitan urban land and green space, which we'll attempt to get our heads around briefly. But just for the next 5-10 minutes, let's just pick up a couple of the questions that were raised, and then we'll call it a day. I've got a question that perhaps Russell would be kind enough to pick up, which really stems from a lot of the case examples that Russell was giving, where the scheme has been brilliantly designed by world-leading architects who often, if you're lucky, give evidence at the inquiry, if there is one. And the question Russell has asked of us, how do you make sure that the client in value engineering the scheme doesn't, as it were, dispense with the services of that architect, and in some cases, if you're looking at it pejoratively, seek to dumb down the building? Do you have any experience of that kind of thing?
Yes, a lot. I've often had to address that very suggestion at inquiries, and indeed I did a bit of work for CABE when they continued to exist with Richard Coleman on the best ways to avoid it. And it doesn't only arise when you've got a dumbing down client, because oftentimes you've got a positive client who's gone to an architect for a specific reason and has worked with the world-beating architect in working up a really good consent, but they are nervous about having, say, a Section 106 obligation, which ties them to that architect for the rest of the scheme, not least because it gives that architect an incredible ransom position when it comes to fees, payment and delay and everything else. So we've come across that this often, and I think there are two ways of dealing with it. For the positive client who wants the benefit, which is a public benefit of having this named architect as part of the scheme, then John, what you do is you offer in the Section 106 to keep them on, but you don't create a ransom. You allow them, you allow the client to engage another named architect or group of named architects under the control of the local authority or CABE or the RICS, which just reduces the ransom that the architect has, and also ensures that you can build your scheme out if the architect falls under a bus, for example. So for the positive client, that's the way forward. For the more negative dumbing down client, and remember, sometimes an owner will buy in long after the consent, thinking of Beetham Tower, for example, the Blackfriars Tower. The only way in which you can do it, and John Gray, the inspector, was master of this, is to ensure that you identify as the grantor, and in this case it was the Secretary of State, the key parts of the scheme which need to have, if you like, the architect's signature on them, and you require those to be produced at a very, very large scale. Then you ask the architect, and this happened at both Beetham and the Shard, to produce a document which identifies the key elements of the party in their mind, and you sort of enshrine that in the form of a code in the conditions. and hope that they are so central to the grant of permission that they are unlikely to be undone by Section 73. Other than those two routes, in all of my years of doing tall buildings, I've not come across anything more satisfactory than the John Gray solution, which in effect is to get the architect's signature so woven into the detailed plans that his DNA is all over them. That's my answer.
No, agreed, Russell. And obviously, when you're discussing this type of thing in the context potentially of a 106 discussion at the inquiry, it can be quite useful in terms of getting planning permission to begin with. Because I remember in one case, tall building case that I did, the local authority representative, in justifying the 106 requirement, let it slip that they wanted it in there because the scheme was of such high quality that it was necessary for the architect to be kept on, which I could see the inspector carefully writing down as it was said. But yeah, absolutely. Let me take one other question about a different topic and then come back to a couple of points on MOL and another point on tall buildings and carbon, Russell, which you might see in the Q&A that we'll come back to in a second. But briefly, somebody asks about affordable housing and viability in London in this likely recessionary period that we're going to be heading into, may already be in. Will it be easier to secure a reduction in affordable housing post-consent if the consents are already there in the future? And let me offer my thoughts very briefly on that before seeing if anybody else wants to contribute on it. I think plainly there will be real world viability impacts which will need to be addressed. And I think the question is how. We have 106A, B routes, but of course, to some extent that depends if the consent is relatively recent on a willing local authority, and then on the operation of 106B or 106A6C and justifying a modification in terms of delivery of the scheme. You've got Section 73 seeking changes to the scheme itself, which might allow renegotiation of the viability assessment in terms of producing a new planning consent. But I think actually the key to this is likely to be central government policy and or guidance to assist, to make it much more possible for developers to seek changes to existing affordable housing settlements, if you like. And we're going to have to look to central government to generate that guidance, suggest it, put pressure on them to do so in the next few months. That's the best way I can see to securing that. I don't know whether anybody else wants to contribute on potential renegotiation of affordable housing.
Yeah, I think picking on the point you make there, Rupert, absolutely agree. We need central government guidance because without it, unfortunately, authorities will use the hiding place of the Act to say, well, this is a relatively recent consent (brackets) which we didn't like in the first place, and therefore we're not re-entering negotiations on the 106. So absolutely critical. We have central government movement on that. Yes.
And of course, the position with the evolving London plan creeping towards its conclusion, and still having the SPG in place doesn't I think assist in those discussions, certainly at the GLA level. Okay, there's a point, Rob, while you're on, as it were, that somebody asks about waiting to decisions to grant permission in the metropolitan open land, if consent in a particular situation has been granted because of the benefits of a D1 use outweighing, a bit like Harrow, I suppose, outweighing the impacts on the consent. How do you see, by contrast, potentially weight to be given to housing if the site is being moved from those community uses to potentially a residential led scheme?
Yeah, it's going to be site specific and it's going to be need specific. And going back to the point I made in my presentation, great that if there's some indication that a site can come out of its use to a particular another use, but if you're going in fresh with housing, you are going to have to justify that in its own right. To the extent that there's a fallback, if it's another use, it's not really going to help you that much. If you're not interested in bringing that forward yourself. And so I think, yeah, it's a good start, but you've got a long way to go if you're coming in with another type of scheme.
Yeah, and I think, Rob, it partly goes, doesn't it, to the point that, in a sense, I was making, and Russell was making, when talking about schemes that have really worked in recent times, whether they're tall building schemes or just regen schemes, that it's about not just the unit numbers and the viability, but the narrative of a true improvement to the area. I mean, even more so where one's taking MOL or local green space. The true improvement narrative has to be absolutely unmistakably clear, with most reasonable people agreeing, if you like, that it would be a huge improvement in planning terms overall, I guess.
Yeah. It's a if we just get rid of the exceptional circumstances test and just replace it with it's a really good idea test, that would be the quickest way through it.
I'll pass that on, Rob. Yeah. Okay. So just let me come back to a question, Russell. I don't know whether you can see it on the question and answer session about zero carbon. I mean, I'll ask Heather potentially if she has anything to add on this as well. But somebody refers to the fact that we've not focused. It's difficult to focus on everything, obviously, but on the zero carbon agenda. Which is a challenge, isn't it, when one's dealing with an absolutely enormous lump of concrete and steel, and whether, you know, the disbenefit in the carbon neutral agenda is something that makes it more difficult to secure permission on tall buildings?
I think it does, and increasingly it will be a question that will be raised. But at the minute, the planning system as a whole has indicated that there is overall a need for densification of the most accessible, most well-connected brownfield sites as part of the overall sustainability agenda. It means that we use less greenfield sites, fewer green belt sites. And I think the planning system at the minute says that we should densify, and the best way of densifying in context is to go high. But what that then means is there's a duty on those who are developing high to make the buildings as carbon neutral as they can. And I think the emphasis is going to be increased on that over the years, and people will have to try harder. If you look at 22 Bishopsgate, for example, it claims to be carbon neutral, and the exercise has been done. It was looked at very carefully by the city and also by the mayor. I think that scrutiny will increase. I don't think it'll increase to the extent that we say densification of the city is the wrong place. I think always you will find that the benefits in terms of travel, in terms of not using greenfield sites, is going to lie with the densification of the city, at least going forward. Things might change post-COVID, who knows? But at the minute, that's where the balance lies. It lies in favour of densification and then doing the best you can with the buildings that are denser.
Yeah, I agree, Russell, and I think that Lewisham scheme's a good example of where one can set off, if you like, impacts on carbon through the design of the buildings themselves with open space and greenery. And there's quite an interesting scheme coming forward at Cross Harbour District Centre on the Isle of Dogs at the moment, where partly because of the relationship with the Mudshoot Park, but partly for this reason, extensive kind of hanging gardens of Babylon type approach is being taken to the greening of the scheme, which is directly relevant, I think, to this carbon issue. And I think we could even, dare I say it, in the city, see a little bit more of that taking place. I don't know whether you're finding that as well.
Yeah, no, I am. I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder whether we can take one more question before we finish. We haven't got very much time, but Russell, again, directly for you, I guess, but others may have views on this as well. Cumulative impacts. I know we all have to do them now in our TVIAs and so on. And there's especially on the Isle of Dogs, there's the now familiar kind of red line background of consented pipeline schemes. But it does, in a way, I think the question's aimed at something which we're grappling with in the real world. The more of these buildings they are, the more they occlude the views and the contribution that existing excellent tall buildings make. Are we in danger, I guess another way of putting the question is, of crowding out quality?
Yeah, I think we are. And it's difficult because, take the Gherkin, for example, it's not a heritage asset of any description applying the analysis. And yet it is, as I've said, a much loved part of the skyline of London. And it may be argued that it ought to be a material consideration that its seclusion by other buildings needs some sort of protection, or for some other type of development to take place to allow it to feature again. But I don't see anything within the existing guidance that is going to allow that anytime soon. So I'm not sure there's much we can do in terms of that. It is also the case, of course, that cumulative impact generally has got to be a material consideration that inspectors and others take into account. And that will include the cumulative impact of what the question says is the dehumanizing impact of having lots of tall towers. That's part and parcel of the architect's job when looking at context. They've got to decide whether their building, in addition to others which have been consented or are in the pipeline, but particularly those that have been consented, is creating cumulatively not just development control issues, but a sense or feeling of oppression that can come from taller buildings. I think that's part and parcel of the consideration of the architect's contextual analysis.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. I think probably chaps will draw stumps at that point. I hope those of you viewing the webinar have found some points of interest and use going forward. I'd make a plea, I think, on behalf of not just the four or five of us, but Landmark as a whole, that there are some projects, I think, that we should probably be doing together in the next 6 months to 12 months on a number of these points. So obviously, outside normal casework, do contact us if you want to take any of these ideas forward, because, you know, to adapt the old saying, if you're tired of London planning, then you're tired of life. So do come back to us. Can I end by wishing you a good rest of day, and by thanking very much my fellow speakers, Russell Harris, Heather Sargent, and Robert Walton. And at that point, we'll draw stumps. Thank you very much indeed.